Okay, we're on. So if we can see that and shout. All right, so here we go. So we're still in the set of lessons that are to do with self-healing, and this is the Aya healing pyramid. And just to remind you that this set of 7 lessons are the same or almost the same as the pyramid course that we teach to the general public on Saturday mornings once a month. So this is the Aya healing pyramid, which hopefully you're getting used to now, with the 3 sides. Side 1 is the blue side, the names of the layers. Side 2 is the self-healing exercises that we apply to each one of the layers, and side 3 is the results of self-healing or the goals of self-healing. And in each lesson we try and approach, or we try and mention each one of these sides. So we start off by explaining what that particular layer is, then we go into side 2, the self-healing techniques, and then we try and finish off right at the end to just explain or show these side 3, the results. So today it is the psychological layer, because we're going down the pyramid. We did the spiritual layer last week, and today it's the psychological. And we're going to spend quite a lot of time on the mask as well, explaining a bit more about the mask identity, the little self, the psychological self, the ego, the egoic identity, all these different names that people have for this thing. But really it's about identity. And we're going to spend a bit of time on it because it is one of the most important things to understand about the psychological layer. And you could say that the mask identity is what causes us all our problems. And on a collective level, you could say that the mask identity is what causes all the problems in the world. So understanding the mask identity is super important for self-healing and for the silent revolution. Because don't forget, this is what we want to teach to people. This is what needs to be applied to the collective so that we can see lasting change in the world. So let's look a bit closer into the psychological layer. And you've seen this before, a couple of lessons ago, this analogy of a house where everything in the brickwork is subconscious and everything in the roof is conscious. So this is a bit of a reminder, you've seen this before, but I've added a few things in now. So the mind stream in the present moment is conscious, of course. But the mind stream is very much connected to the emotions. Our thoughts are connected to our emotions. That's the emotional cycle, which we went through a couple of lessons ago as well. That's part of the emotional layer. But the emotions deserve a mention here because they are involved with the mind stream. They kind of work together with the mind stream to produce the emotional cycle. So we go about our lives having thoughts and emotions, experiences, all our lives. Every day, every minute of our lives, in the present moment, of course. And these turn into memories that get laid down in our subconscious. And they get laid down in a bit of a haphazard way if the mind is left to its own devices. And I say haphazard way, you might say, well, the brain is very structured and organised. But when I mean haphazard, I mean it causes problems. There's problems in the subconscious because we're letting our memories get formed completely subconsciously without any control whatsoever. And out of these stack of memories come personality characteristics. So our personality characteristics are just a result of all our memories. And out of these personality characteristics, we derive a set of values. Now I'm going to define some of these words in just a second. But our values are what we prioritise. Now, something a little bit different to the last diagram you saw, because there's an extra step in here, and this is where the mask goes. The mask identity is just underneath the conscious layer, or conscious level, you could say. It is a subconscious mechanism, the mask identity. But actually, that identity is what is creating the mind stream. So all our thoughts and emotions get produced from the identity, the human identity, or the ego, you could say. And then we go round in this circle, or this cycle. So this cycle can actually be very destructive if it's left to its own devices. It can spiral into negativity, and we all know it. We've all seen it happen in ourselves during or throughout our lives, and we can all see it happening in other people. Now the thing is about this particular cycle is that the mind stream and emotions are actually influencing how the memories are laid down. So the mind stream and emotions in the present moment are influencing how we remember things. This is an evolutionary tactic which we talked about in the last lesson, 2 lessons ago. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism. So for example, in early animals, when emotions first evolved, things like fear, basic emotions evolved first, most likely. Things like fear, survival-related emotions. Fear will keep an animal alive because it will have a dangerous situation, it will cause extreme fear, and then that fear will get burnt into memory. And then it will keep away from that dangerous situation next time because of thoughts, worrying, anxiety. So these memories get laid down in a particular fashion, influenced by the mind stream and emotions. And if you go right round the cycle up to the mask is actually a product of all those memories, but it's also producing the mind stream. So it's a cycle. One thing is creating the other. So left to its own devices, this often spirals into negativity. But it is possible to spiral the other way, spiral into positivity. It's possible to take control of this particular process. And that's what this layer is about, or this lesson is about, taking control of the processes, the subconscious processes that are producing the mind stream and emotion. Now, if you think about it, if we want to make lasting change in the world, then it's behaviour that needs to change, of course, how people act. But actions are always preceded by the psychology in the personality. It's the personality which is producing behaviour. So if we want to change our behaviour, then we have to look at the psychology in the personality which is producing that behaviour. So trying to change people's behaviours in some way, with laws, for example, legal system, that will go to a certain point, but it's never going to change people fundamentally because we're not looking at where behaviour is actually coming from. So we need to encourage people to look inside themselves instead of outside themselves, to change their behaviour. And then, collectively speaking, the whole of society can then change. That's our concept of the silent revolution, or part of it. So let's have a quick look at some definitions of these words, just so that we're talking about the same thing, basically, because language is very important and people might define things in different ways. So this is what we mean when we use these words. So the mind stream, not surprisingly, the stream of thought that flows constantly through our mind. Emotions. So an emotion, what we're talking about here is a physiological response in the material body resulting from patterns of thought involving the limbic and endocrine systems, which is systems in the material body, leading to a conscious experience of positive or negative. So that's what we're calling the emotion itself. It's a response in the material body. It's that fizzing feeling that you either feel as negative, or it feels fizzing if it's negative, or you feel it as positive. So the emotions are what cause us to feel good or bad, let's say. Now, a personality characteristic. That is a repeating emotion or set of emotions linked to a pattern of thinking that gives the emotions a certain context. So that emotion in context must be a continuing pattern for it to be considered a characteristic. So I'll give you an example here. As a child, if somebody is almost run over by a bus, they get in the way of a bus, they get out of the way, and that causes a huge amount of fear in that moment. Now, if that's it, no more, they don't start, it goes no further, then that's not, fear of buses is not a personality characteristic. But if that carries on in their psychology, so every time they see a bus, they feel fear, or in between, if they're constantly worrying about buses or being afraid of buses, and that is repeating, a continued repeating pattern of thinking and emotions, you could then call it a personality characteristic. And that person has a fear of buses. So that's what we mean by personality characteristic. A value is just a characteristic or emotion that has been given a place of high importance. So it's just everyone's values are different, whatever you prioritize, whatever you feel that is important. And the mask identity. So this can be described as the psychological structure that gives the personality characteristics a centered sense of self or identity. So all that mass of personality characteristics needs a little sense of self, needs a little sense of identity. And that's the mask identity. But it is a psychological structure. As we talked about in the last lesson, it changes constantly throughout our lives. And that has to do with the changing memories, changing experiences, changing personality characteristics. And if you remember, that's why we said it was impermanent, therefore an illusion, a type of illusion compared to the true self. Any questions before I carry on? Yeah, well picked up. And we do go into this a little bit later in the lesson as well. So basically, I think that yes, there's always thoughts connected to it, but sometimes those thoughts go so deep into our subconscious that you don't experience them consciously, if you know what I mean. So absolutely, if it's such a long-standing characteristic, it just goes so deep that in the end you just feel emotions in a situation you don't know why. Yes, absolutely. So yes, that's in the emotional layer. We go into how emotional energy can be transferred from person to person and trigger other people's emotional cycle. Absolutely. And but that wouldn't necessarily transfer a personality characteristic. So the psychology in the mind stays pretty fixed. But you can pick up on people's emotions, and it activates your emotional cycle. I suppose if that's an interesting thing to bring up, because and I don't know the answer to this, but perhaps if you constantly picked up on the same person's emotions over a long period of time, then maybe there would be an influence, and it would influence the psychology as well. Okay, so I think that it will be. That's a very good question, but I think we have to go back to the idea of karma here, because it's emotional memory, and emotional memory is tied to a context of some kind. So karma is tied to a context. So this is what actually derives our personality characteristics that we have from before our birth. We call it a karmic personality spectrum. So I think that it will actually come from some sort of context originally. And when we're born, we have this sort of bundle of karma, or karma is emotion plus context. And that context really is a set of thinking patterns. So when we feel a sudden emotion, it does have an origin with a emotion plus context. So I think that it does. But it's a very good question. We should maybe look into that a little bit more. And there's some other exceptions to that as well, because if you're talking about love, then there's some other sources of love. Unconditional love, for example, can come from the ninth chakra, and love is a slightly different emotion to maybe all the other ones. We call it the highest emotion, but it is still an emotion. But it can, if it's unconditional love, that comes without a context, because unconditional love itself is without condition, you could say. So yeah, possibly. I came round to agreeing with you there, I think. Yeah, sure. And that could be something to do with emotional energy transfer, because as you walk past somebody, if you meet eyes with them, or if there's any connection there, your chakra cords are just jumping straight to each other. And there could be emotional transfer going in between two people there. So that there's another way that emotions could be triggered that is not part of the emotional cycle, actually. And you just mentioned it, and that is through intuition. So our higher minds communicate with our low minds, or guide them, or keep them on the life plan through intuition. And intuition comes through in various forms. And we'll learn about it in the intuition lesson, but the sensation of knowing comes through the crown chakra, information comes through the brow chakra, focus comes through the throat chakra, love comes through the heart chakra. So So basically the higher mind can activate the heart chakra to make that person feel love if they need to. And that would be from like a past life connection or something like that. So there are some exceptions, absolutely. The answer would go to the karmic personality spectrum, I think. So what karmas are there in place already, basically? So the reason why we are different. So let's say two twins, for example. Two twins are identical in genetics and pretty much identical in upbringing, let's say. Can be completely different personalities. And the reason is the karmic personality spectrum. What base of personality has been dragged through from many previous lives? And that personality spectrum, when we look at karma, there are thousands and thousands of different types, because a karma is an emotional memory plus a context. And the context tends to be based, or was created by thinking patterns. And so in that situation that you've asked about there could be a whole set of karmas that influences the way people react to that particular situation. And that could be different in those two twins, because they have completely different karmic personality spectrum. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I completely agree. I think that it's not just the karmic personality spectrum that determines the personality. There's environment, and there's also genetics as well. So there's all sorts of things that influence how that personality grows. But when you're born, you start with that base, and then all that karma starts burning as the baby starts to grow. The karma starts burning, but then loads of other influences come in and change that and grow that personality along the way, which is why our personalities are different, very different from life to incarnation, because of all those influences. But we drag through that base layer of personality through karma. I will quickly, but that we do go into that more in the lesson, the emotional layer. But what I mean is that the karma is a fuel for the emotional cycle. That's all it is. It's an emotional memory, but when it gets processed and activated, it produces an emotion. Yes, it does. It shapes our response, absolutely. But there's other influences as well. And throughout that life, we are also producing more. We're constantly producing more through our thought patterns. So it doesn't. You don't just start off your life with a chunk of karma and then you're burning it through your life. You're constantly producing more as well. So there's current life karma and there's also past life. Okay, so the next thing to look at in the psychological layer is energy psychology. So this is a term that exists already in healing circles. So energy psychology is the connection between the energy in our bioenergy layers and psychology. More specifically, the chakras. How the chakras are connected to the personality. Because there are 5 particular chakras which are part of energy psychology. And these 5 chakras are the emotion regulating chakras. So there's a connection between the emotion regulating chakras and the personality. It's how or why we say that these chakras regulate our emotions, because they're linked to personality characteristics. So first of all, we should broadly say that each one of those chakras has access to the emotional system in the material body. So I've represented the emotional system in the material body just by naming the 2 major systems in the material body that produce emotions, the limbic system and the endocrine system. Not very important for the moment to go into them in specific detail. The endocrine system is just a system of glands that produce hormones and help regulate the body, and including emotional reactions. And also the limbic system is a system in the brain which is very much linked into our emotional system. But let's leave that for a minute. That's the emotional response. Okay, so the emotion chakras have access to that system. So each one of those chakras can activate any of the emotions. That's what we're trying to say here. So the throat chakra can activate love. It can activate fear. It can activate anger. It can activate a whole range of emotions. Each one of these chakras actually regulates a set of characteristics in the personality. So this is where the connection comes from, energy psychology. So these are sets of characteristics. And, these are fairly well known as well in healing circles, let's say, or spiritual circles. And you've probably seen some of this before. So the throat chakra regulates characteristics to do with communication of self-expression. Communicating and especially self-expression. The heart chakra regulates attachment to loving relationships. Anyone that we have a loving relationship in our life or that we should do is governed by the heart chakra. The solar plexus chakra is all about identification with beliefs. It's our belief system, what we believe about the world around us and what we believe about ourselves. The sacral is reproduction and parental care. So that's all about our children. And the root chakra is all about safety, security and survival. Our own personal safety, security and survival. Now you could consider these sets of characteristics as a balance scale, where the balance is in the middle, as you can see on this diagram. On one side you've got too little of something, on the other side you've got too much of something, and the balance is in the middle. Now, I'm going to go through some examples later, so don't worry. But the point here is to say that these balance scales, at the edges or extremes of the balance scales, is where you get negative emotions. So each characteristic can be separated into a balance scale. But if you put them all together, our whole personality can also be considered as a balance scale, where we want to try and get to the middle, because in the middle, the balance point is where the positive emotions. So the extremes of the balance scale, you're going to feel some negative emotions, whatever they are, and the positive emotions are in the middle. That's where we want to get to in the personality. If we're doing work on the psychological layer, we want to try and get to the balance point where the positive emotions are. And we'll come back to that, by the way, in the exercises towards the end of the lesson. We'll come back to that balance scale. So it's a very important part of this lesson, that balance scale. But for now, let's have a look at the solar plexus chakra, which is identification with beliefs. So what's so important about the solar plexus chakra? Well, the solar plexus chakra kind of governs all the other ones. Identification with beliefs kind of governs all of the other characteristics in a way. I'll go through some examples, don't worry. But this is about who we think we are. Identity. This is the human identity. This is where the identity gets really governed from. It's the solar plexus chakra, identification with beliefs, identity. Now, you've probably heard of the term inner child, or working on the inner child, or that kind of these kind of terms. Well, that's really referring to the solar plexus, and some people I think call the solar plexus the inner child chakra even. And that's the same sort of subject, because as you're a child, this is where the identity really gets founded. Now, the identity changes throughout the course of somebody's life, but those early years are the powerful years, aren't they? This is where the identity really gets solidified or gets created, and then from then on it changes less and less the more rooted it becomes, you could say. So the point here is that solar plexus chakra is important to understand, identification with beliefs, and we're going to talk about that more in just a second. But here, just to remind you, it's a false identity because it's impermanent. We talked about that last lesson. The mask identity changes throughout the course of our lives. It's impermanent, so we are saying it is a false identity. It's not your true identity. I want to keep reminding you of that, or reminding you of the spiritual layer as we go through this. So let's look a little bit more about, or look at a little bit more about the solar plexus and identification with beliefs. So let's have a look at a few different types of beliefs and see if we are identified with them in the personality. So you can have beliefs about the world around you. I believe the fire will burn me. I believe the water will drown me. These are survival-related beliefs. They're very useful beliefs, of course, aren't they? Do we get identified with them? Does that become part of our identity? I would say no. You don't go around saying, I am a believer in the fire will burn me, do you? So there are lots of different types of beliefs that don't get wrapped up into and identity? What about beliefs or opinions in ideology or religions? All sorts of beliefs people have in this subject. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you get what I'm talking about here. I believe in this. I believe in that. Ideology or religions or opinions. Lots of these going on. So do we get identified with these type of beliefs? I would say yes, absolutely. This becomes part of people's personality. This becomes part of people's identity. Never more than currently, to be honest. The left wing, the right wing, for example, is a very good example here. How do we know if we're identified, though? If you're doing introspection, or if you're looking at your own personality and trying to figure out everything in the psychology, how do we know if we're identified with something? Well, it's all about how much emotion you feel. Now, don't forget, this is what we're teaching as part of the self-healing course. So I want to keep reminding you of that as well. This is what we teach to people. This is what we're trying to teach to people. This kind of doesn't really apply to you guys anymore because you are past the Kundalini phase of self-realization. Just want to repeat that again. And when you go into the phases of self-realization, everything changes, everything turns on its head. And we can talk about that after this presentation a bit more if you want. But so just remember, this is what we're teaching to people, to the general public. This is part of our pyramid course. So how do you know if you're identified with something? Well, it's about how much emotion that person feels. Just going back to the left wing, right wing. I am left wing, I am right wing. How much emotion does that invoke? That will tell you how much somebody is identified with that particular characteristic. And what about beliefs about oneself? So we've talked about beliefs about the world around us. We've talked about ideologies and religions and that type of thing, or opinions. And now beliefs about oneself. And we talked about this in the last lesson, didn't we? This tends to be the strongest type of identity, what we believe ourselves to be. But the problem is that quite often we can have limiting beliefs or wrong beliefs. So a limiting belief is one of these characteristics that limits us in some way, stops us from doing something. A wrong belief is just, it means it's just completely wrong. But the thing is, the mind and brain, the way it works, doesn't care whether something's wrong or not. It's not how it works. It's a survival mechanism. It's a habit-forming computer. That's what the mind is, or the brain. It just forms habits with a mind to survival, for surviving. It's there to try and keep the material body alive at the end of the day. So you can have completely wrong beliefs, but the mind doesn't care. It still gets ingrained into the identity. So do we get identified with these particular characteristics? Absolutely. Definitely. I am this, I am that. Constantly. That's what the identity, the mask identity is constantly saying. Identifying with all sorts of different things. And it's a false identity. What a shame. It's a false identity because it's impermanent. So all these problems that we see around the world, because of these identities, different people's identities, different belief systems, they're false identities and they're impermanent. Any more questions or anything? Yeah, so we cling to them because it's a survival mechanism. So the ego is fighting for its life, basically. The ego subconsciously doesn't know when it's actually in danger. It's just a mechanism. So when you challenge someone's identity, you're challenging the ego's existence. You're challenging the ego's actual right to exist or right to survive. So that's why the ego will react violently if necessary to defend its own existence, defend its own identity. And then that dictates people's actions or behaviour. Yes, I would say that is absolutely true. Yes, absolutely. And it's the same reason that we've always seen conflict for. But there's another reason why we're seeing so much conflict in the world now, and that is just going back to that idea of planetary cycles and the age of suffering, and then the global awakening at the end of the age of suffering. You see this big dip just before the global awakening because everything sort of crumbles, you could say. And another thing that's going on there is there's a balancing. You have to find balance before awakening, and you can see it on a global scale. Things are actually balancing. Right and left is a good The political scale is a good example here. You can actually see the rise of the right, because it's been sort of left dominated or liberal dominated for quite a while, but the rise of the right is actually balancing things out. But from that point there, that's where we see the explosion of awakening. And yeah, but because of that balancing out, you do see, unfortunately, a lot of conflict. And that's why it looks like conflict is increasing at the moment. It's because of that. The two, everything's becoming polarized. In almost all forms of life, everything's becoming more and more polarized. But I think it's important to zoom out and see the bigger picture and understand that actually it's just a necessary part of the actual global awakening. Yeah, unfortunately. So worth a quick mention is the self-esteem scale. The self-esteem scale is part of the psychological layer. So it's a completely different scale to the balance scale I was talking about. It's all within the identity. You know, people can have a lot of self-doubt at the low end of the scale. They can have arrogance, you could say, at the top end of the scale. And then there could be a healthy confidence in the middle. But, and the healthy confidence is where, you know, we want people to be. However, I think it's important to note that this is all still within the identity. Confidence itself is still part of the psychological layer. And as you go through self-realization, just another quick note here, as you go through self-realization, you might start to feel like you become more confident, but actually it's something completely different. Confidence completely disappears. The self-esteem scale completely disappears. Through self-realization, you remove yourself from that scale completely. That's very important. As you go through the phases of self-realization and you start to feel more confident, I'm using the word just because it's difficult to describe anything else, but actually know that you are actually pulling yourself out of this scale completely. Yes, that's a good word, absolutely. And it would be good to use a different word, that's for sure. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, all fear disappears. So all fear and negative emotions gradually disappear. So you live in a state of inner peace, which you could call a state of assurance. You have complete confidence in your actions, but it's not in that self-esteem scale. It is a difficult thing to articulate, I suppose, and you just got to go and experience it. But that self-esteem scale completely crumbles. It's no longer, let's say that your assurance or confidence is no longer dependent on the self-esteem scale. It's no longer dependent on your surroundings. It's no longer dependent on how you judge yourself. Because that's what's happened. What happens with the self-esteem scale here. People judge themselves, and then they compare it to others. Well, okay, now we're just talking about language, I suppose, but you could say that the source is infinite and permanent, and it creates the idea of separation. It creates the separation of form, and it gets lost in that separation of form. And its journey back to itself is the journey of life and the journey of the physical the universe of form. So the universe of form gets created, and then the journey of life throughout the journey of the universe. There's lots of little journeys of life, and that journey of life comes back towards the truth, the source, the truth of its unity, basically. So throughout that journey of life, lots of little separated forms of life are created, and it grows to such a point, self-awareness grows to such a point where you could say there's an individual little awareness in everybody, but eventually that being realizes itself. It goes through self-realization, and that's the actual source of the universe, which is realizing itself through that separate being. So the one becomes the many, and then the many become one. That's right, yes. Yeah. Should we have a little break? I remembered today. So moving on to side 2 of the pyramid. So we talked about side 1 of the pyramid, the psychological layer, and all the bits and bobs that go into the psychological. Let's talk about side 2, awareness of the mind stream. So first of all, let's go back to this analogy of a house, and just to remind ourselves about that quickly. Mind stream and emotions go into or influence how those memories are laid down. And out of that becomes personality characteristics, and then values, and then the mask identity, which is kind of governing everything else. If you remember energy psychology, that solar plexus chakra, the identification with beliefs, kind of governs the rest of the characteristics. And I'll go through an example of that in a second. But that's why the mask is kind of governing everything else, and it's presenting the mind stream. It's producing the mind stream, which then triggers emotions. So there's one part of this cycle that we can have control over, and we talked about this 2 lessons ago. And of course, it's in the mind stream. The conscious bit is the only place that we can actually have control over. Our conscious mind stream of thoughts in the present moment. So, side 2, the self-healing techniques that we use to keep this layer healthy. We've given a title of Become Aware of the Mind Stream. So there's different exercises that we're going to talk about, but broadly speaking, they are become aware of the mind stream. And that is because becoming aware of the mind stream is the first thing to do. We can't do anything unless we are aware of the mind stream. You know, it's quite normal for many people to not be aware of the mind stream. Even though they are conscious thoughts, it's very easy to go through your day and not actually be aware of the things that are going through your mind all day long. That's where the damage happens, because the mind just does whatever it wants, basically. You know, worrying about things, anxiety is just a perfect example, really. Just constantly thoughts going round and round and round in somebody's head. So we need to first of all become aware of the mind stream. And then we're going to talk about some different exercises as part of this layer. The first one is called Afflictions of the Mind. The second one is called Personality Scales and Spectrum. And the third one is called Rewire Your Mind. So those are the 3 exercises that we have as part of this layer. To be honest with you, what we've been teaching so far in the pyramid course, actually we've only been doing 2 of them so far. We've only been doing Afflictions of the Mind and Rewire Your Mind. Oh, I've got some balloons for some reason. Don't know. Yeah, in the pyramid course so far we've been doing Afflictions of the Mind and Rewire Your Mind. The personality scales and spectrum is a bit more work, and we want to introduce that at some point as we go along. But let me talk you through them first of all. You know, and by the way, these three exercises can broadly be called introspection, because we are looking inside ourselves. We're looking at our own personality. We're looking at the psychology of our mind. And let me remind you again that this really doesn't apply to you guys, because everything changes after the Kundalini phase and everything gets flipped on its head. And you have no control after the Kundalini phase. So everything before the Kundalini phase, all the build-up towards Kundalini awakening, all the lifetimes of spiritual practice and self-healing, it's all about self-discipline and taking control. Well, now, as you go through Kundalini, and at the end, specifically at the end of the Kundalini phase, and there's a physiological reason for that, which we'll talk about in later lessons, but at the end of the Kundalini phase, it changes and everything flips the other way, and then it becomes about letting go of control and surrendering. So it's the opposite. It's the complete opposite as you go through self-realization. That's something to try and get your head around, really, because that's a big change, and it's part of the surrendering process, in fact, to actually let go of all control over anything. Nevertheless, before Kundalini awakening, it's all about taking control of your own mind and shaping the personality. So let's talk about these 3 exercises. Now, first thing to quickly mention is the concept of acceptance, because if someone has a lot of self-judgment, now I put this in there just because, you know, in a previous lesson someone brought it up, and I thought that they might struggle with some of these exercises because they have a lot of self-judgment, negative self-judgment. So if you're going through the introspective journey, as we're about to go, you can't go through it if you've got a lot of self-judgment, because you just end up heaping loads more judgment on yourself as you go through the journey, and that makes everything worse. So if there is self-judgment in that person, then we have to start by teaching them acceptance. And we do that by treating it as an affliction of the mind, which is actually the first exercise. So if there's self-judgment, the first affliction of the mind to treat is that negative self-judgment. So let's talk about afflictions of the mind, this first exercise. So what is an affliction of the mind? Well, an affliction of the mind is a characteristic that has snowballed larger and larger and become problematic for you or for others around you. So they first start with some sort of traumatic event, and we've talked about this earlier already. Now, we've talked about this earlier in a small way about the child and the bus thing, but basically afflictions of the mind will have a root cause to them, won't they? There will be a traumatic event at some point in somebody's life. Now, when we teach this in the pyramid course, we don't tend to talk much about reincarnation, because this applies if you look at one life, one incarnation, but it also applies if you look at many incarnations. But really, a traumatic event will start this affliction of the mind off at some point. And I'll go to my example that I use because it was part of my self-healing journey, the fear of public speaking. So when I started my career, I realised I had this fear of public speaking. I didn't know where it came from. It was absolutely horrible. It was really stopping me from doing a lot of things. So I started looking into it. I started looking back into my memories to see where it could have possibly started from. Now, with many afflictions, you might know already that where it started, or if with a bit of digging, you might find that memory of where that particular affliction started. For me, I couldn't find any time, any place where this had started. So I started to realise that it was a past life thing. It come from a past life memory. And actually, as I remembered my past lives, as I went through self-realisation, then it started to become clear, because I started remembering where the event actually came from. So first of all, a traumatic event creates a strong emotional reaction. Now, over time, overthinking about that particular event and the strong emotions that come with it makes it get bigger and bigger. So every time that particular thing happens, you get those same emotions every time. And it starts to snowball, because the strong emotions reinforce the memory that's being formed. And this is where we have to talk about the concept of neuroplasticity, which I'm sure some of you are fully aware of already, because it's quite a big concept in neuroscience, and it's also now quite a big concept in healing, in self-help, let's say, or in meditation. Neuroplasticity is the idea, which is, by the way, that now we're into mainstream science, so this is perfectly part of mainstream accepted science. Plasticity is the idea that thought patterns get stronger if you use them a lot. Thought patterns get less if you don't use them. So basically, a thought pattern is just a load of neurons in the brain which are just firing off with electrical signals. That's what a thought pattern is. Every time we have a thought, it's like a little pattern of electrical impulses in neurons. Now, a neuron, every time that it gets used with that particular electrical activity, it grows. So every time you use a thought pattern, it gets stronger. But the opposite is true, that if you don't use a thought pattern, it gets smaller or weaker. The neurons actually they start to shrink. So every time that we have that thought pattern, along with those emotions, those thoughts get stronger and stronger. Or you can think of it like grooves in the mind, if you like. Every time you walk along or run along a groove, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. So that's what these characteristics, these thinking patterns, characteristics, they get stronger and stronger because of that, every time that somebody uses them. Now, over a very long period of time, thought patterns can even become completely subconscious. And this is what we were talking about earlier. And this is what leads to large emotional reactions that seem to have no visible cause. So you don't know where they're coming from, you just have a reaction. Like a phobia, for example. is a good example. But the mind is just a habit-forming machine. So those are just habits. Those characteristics are just habits. Those thought patterns are just habits because of neuroplasticity. And they become afflictions because we've left them to do whatever they want. Now, if we can actually use the neuroplasticity of the brain in the opposite way. Remember at the start when we talked about spiraling into negativity? Well, actually, we can do the opposite. We can spiral into positivity. So we can use the neuroplasticity of the brain in a positive way if we take control over the thought patterns. So with afflictions of the mind, this exercise is all about unraveling those afflictions, undoing those habits in the mind. And those habits took a long time to form, just through constant, repetitive, negative thinking. So in this exercise, we get people to start at least by writing down their afflictions of the mind. It's basically going through the personality and writing down all the characteristics that bother them. Now, by the way, some people are not ready to do this. Some people are ready to do this. So this has to be adapted to whoever we are treating, really. Whatever healing partner we've got, we have to adapt this. Some people are just not ready for this because it can be quite painful. You know, this is a bit like putting a mirror up to somebody's face, and sometimes it's just too much. And you know, sometimes there's trauma, in fact. So there's all sorts of cases where this has to be treated quite carefully. But we're just going through the concept of it here. Okay, so that's afflictions of the mind. Starting by writing down all the afflictions in the mind, in the personality characteristics. Okay, any questions so far before I move on to the next one? Right then. So the next one is personality scales and personality spectrum. So basically, what do we do when we've got a list of of afflictions of the mind? What do we do with them? So we need to start classifying them, first of all. And this is basically making a map of the personality, or a spectrum, a personality spectrum. Because you can classify all of those afflictions of the mind, because they're characteristics, you can classify them in different chakra categories. Because of energy psychology that we talked about earlier, each emotion chakra regulates a different set of characteristics in the personality. So those afflictions we can start putting, we can use something like this. We can start actually placing them, that is a characteristic to do with that particular chakra. For example, the fear of death or fear of losing material possessions, for example, is a root chakra fear. And the characteristic is fear plus context. So we write the characteristic down, and then we write down all the emotions and thoughts that come along with that particular affliction. Now, just something extra here. Next lesson, we're going to be talking about the emotional layer. We're going to be talking about karma and how karma gets involved here as well. So just as a little extra bit, karma is actually what is producing all of this in the first place, because karma is emotional memory. So those characteristics come from our karmic personality spectrum, along with a lot more influences in somebody's life, of course, that we talked about earlier. But that root, the root of the issue has a karmic root. And even if it was a characteristic which had just started in the current life, it's still a karmic issue because we're producing karma as part of our emotional cycle. So it's all emotion and thoughts or emotions have a karmic origin to them, whether it's this life or past life. So this is an example of a personality spectrum where we can start to classify all of our personality characteristics. Although we're just focusing on negative ones at the moment, you know, afflictions of the mind are negative personality characteristics that we want to get rid of because they bother us. But, you know, you could take this concept way further and actually classify everything in your personality, and then you can actually start to strive for healthy values and healthy characteristics. That's when we start to shape our personality. That's when we start to say, well, I don't like that one, that characteristic, but I'd like to have that. I'm going to work towards that. And this is spiritual development, is what we're talking about here. This is less emotional and psychological lesson learning. This is spiritual evolution. Yeah, well, it's exactly this. So a phobia will have a karmic origin. So you could classify a phobia as an affliction of the mind and treat it exactly the same. And arachnophobia, for example, is an example, which is a fear of spiders. It's a fear plus a context. The context is spiders. The emotion would be fear. The thoughts to do with it would be fearful and worrying thoughts regarding the context, the spiders. But I'm going to go through some examples now. So using my own personal examples that I've had in the past, I've just zoomed in to that spectrum, basically. So throat chakra, for example, here. So we need to choose the category. So I've chosen fear of public speaking because that's a good example for me. So I need to choose the category, and that is the throat chakra, because it is all about communication and self-expression. And then I need to write down the emotions and thoughts that I felt when I suffered from fear of public speaking. Now you can see that there's a little balance scale there. So for each characteristic, you can actually create a balance scale where you get the negative emotions at the extremes of the scales and the positive emotions in the middle. And for me, there it was too scared to speak. That was one extreme. Now the emotions would be fear, anger, shame, despair, anxiety, etc., etc. The thoughts, will I look nervous while I'm speaking? Will everyone know that I'm nervous? Will I know my subject enough? I'm terrible at speaking. Or afterwards it would be, did I look nervous? Did they know I was nervous? All those silly thoughts are constantly over and over and over. So the idea is to gradually bring yourself back into that balance point where you're going to find the positive emotions to do with that characteristic. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a second. That's the third exercise. But another example, still sticking with the throat chakra here. Speaking your truth. Now, self-expression, that is. Now, the throat chakra is well known for, the speaking your truth thing. And here's a good example. About 2 lifetimes ago, and also 4 lifetimes ago, I was gay. I was a gay woman 2 lifetimes ago in the 19th century. I was a gay man in the 17th century. That caused a massive blockage in the throat chakra, all about speaking your truth. And on this balance scale, it's on the side of keeping too many secrets. You could say the opposite end of the scale would be oversharing, of course. Either way, there's going to be negative emotions. So the emotions that would have brought up: fear, guilt, shame, anger, anxiety. And this was illegal. Being gay was obviously illegal and had the death penalty. The thoughts involved with that: it will cause problems, I'll get into trouble, I won't be accepted, all these type of things. So again, the idea is to bring that characteristic back into the balance. Okay, another example. And this is again another one of my examples. Fear of judgment. One end of the scale is that you care too much about what people think of you. The completely other end of the scale is you don't care at all what people think of you. Now, either one of them are going to cause problems. It's good to be just around the balance point. Now, just a quick reminder again, this is all within the psychological layer. As you go through self-realization, all this changes. And you remove yourself completely from all of these scales. Fear of judgment, again, trying to bring it back to the center balance point to find the positive emotions. Now, an interesting one about the fear of judgment, it's an identification with beliefs. It's the solar plexus, and this is where I want to show how it has a governing effect on all the others. Because this particular characteristic, if it's the solar plexus chakra, we should try and find that belief, find the limiting belief. And this one here was, I believe that what people think of me can harm me. That's a limiting or wrong belief. But it has an impact on all the others. So a good example here is that this fear of judgment increased the fear of public speaking. So it had an inflationary impact on other characteristics, which is why the solar plexus chakra is said to govern all the rest of them, or the identity is governing the rest of the psychology in a way, where it has a massive impact. Okay, so we've talked about afflictions of the mind, writing down the afflictions of the mind, and then personality scales, personality spectrum. And really this is just mapping out the personality or the afflictions of the mind before we do something about them. And this is the exercise that we suggest to do something about them. Rewire your mind. So this is a bit like taking out the trash, basically. This is a bit like rummaging around in the subconscious and getting rid of what you don't want. That's what this is all about. So first of all, you choose your most troublesome affliction of the mind. Now this is the key here. You need to become aware the moment the thought pattern hits. So you know what the affliction is. You spent a lot of time trying to figure the afflictions of the mind out. And we know what thoughts and emotions that are involved in that particular affliction. So hopefully by now, the person will be aware of the thoughts and the emotions. So for this exercise, this has to happen in the present moment. We need to become aware the moment those thought patterns hit, those negative thought patterns, we've got to become aware in the moment. And then we reverse the thought pattern. And this is where we're using the neuroplasticity of the mind-brain. We can reverse it. So how do we do that? So we can use mantra meditation or visualizations or even our actions. But mantra meditation is usually the easiest. And I'll take one of my examples when I did this was the fear of judgment. So I took a mantra which said something like, I don't care what anyone in the world thinks of me, for example. And I would, as soon as any worrying thoughts came in, I would repeat that. And it's important to choose the complete other end of the scale. So if I'm right over on one side of the scale saying I care too much about what people think of me, I choose the complete opposite end of the scale. I don't care what anyone thinks of me because it carries the most weight. And you repeat and repeat and repeat on top of those worrying thoughts. But it's very important here is to drop that mantra once you reach the balance point. And I remember finding that balance point and dropping the mantra. Because if you go too far the other way, it will take your personality the other way. And you don't want to go to the other end of the extreme, do you? Because that's where more negative emotions are. You want to find that balance point. So you keep repeating that mantra over and over and over until you reach that balance point, and then you drop it. Now you can use mantra meditation, or you can use visualization. Sometimes I would add a visualization in. For example, I'd try to figure out which people gave me the strongest reaction of whose judgment I feared, and I would visualize them while I was saying it, for example, like my employer or whatever. Now the key to this is not only doing it in the present moment, but also the repetition, because when we talk about neuroplasticity, this happens over time. You know, those afflictions of the mind took quite a long time to get to that point. Years and years and years of constantly repetitive negative thinking. Those neurons are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or those grooves deeper and deeper and deeper. Which is why it takes time to reverse it. So just doing that mantra once or twice or doing it for a week is not really going to do anything at all. This has to be done repetitively, constantly, whenever you get those thoughts. And eventually it will change. Any questions about that? Okay, we're almost done here. Just a few slides which we don't actually have part of the pyramid course, and we'll probably integrate this at some point in the future. But it's about striving for growth. So the center balance point is where the healthy characteristics are. We've talked about that already. Now, so far we've just talked about choosing the afflictions of the mind and trying to remove them. That's just working on the negative parts, removing the negative parts of our personality. Well, actually, you can do the other side as well. You can actually choose healthy characteristics Make them your values. So this is a bit like having a full understanding and control of the personality and relentlessly pursuing the healthy values and minimizing the unhealthy ones. And of course, as I said earlier, this is spiritual development. That's what we're talking about here. It's a life's work or a life plan. This is what the higher mind is up to when it's designing a life plan and trying to keep its lower mind on the life plan. Lesson learning through, as the Kundalini grows through the major emotion chakras, lesson learning on the way, spiritual development. And for any of you who are into yoga, this is a particular type of yoga called Raja Yoga that has been known about for, or practiced for, thousands of years. So just lastly, a reminder about the third side, side 3 of the pyramid, which is the results of self-healing, but also shows the cascading effect of self-healing down the pyramid. So if we spend as much time in the spiritual layer, trying to find that peace and unity, then it's going to have an impact on the psychological layer. It's going to smooth out the psychological layer very slowly. But we're not just relying on the spiritual layer, we're working on the psychological layer as well. Through adding all these exercises in to work on the psychological layer to create more healthy values. And that's going to impact into the emotional layer because it's going to make people produce more positive karma emotions and less negative ones. So they're going to end up feeling less negative emotions and more positive ones, which then impacts the bioenergy layer because we end up with balanced emotion chakras rather than blocked emotion chakras, which has a massive impact on our emotional stability, but also has a very big impact on the health of the material body as well, because blockages in the bioenergy layer have a big impact on the health of the material body. We'll talk about that later on. Okay, there we go. That's it for today. A bit of a chunky one, that, the psychological layer. Anyone got anything to talk about? Any questions about any of that? There's a lot there, I know. Yes, so if somebody is ready for it, I think absolutely, and we've got some forms ready to go. We just haven't implemented it quite yet, but we've got some forms ready to go to help people write them down. But it's going to be a case by case, I think. It's if somebody's ready for it and wants to learn about that particular thing, then I think we should, absolutely. But, you know, self-healing in terms of all the different layers, it's the good thing about treating all of the different layers is that you can, if somebody has a block with looking into their own psychology, then you can still work on all the other layers as well. So breath work, for example, in the bioenergy layer is a mechanical thing. You don't even have to look inside the psychology at all, and that works. You know, you're just doing mechanical breath work, and that unblocks blockages in the chakras and meridian system and other systems. That unblocks just in a mechanical way, just from doing the exercise. So there's other ways around it, but yeah, definitely. And there's other ways that you can get around it as well. You know, like artwork, for example, is a good way of meditating for somebody who will struggle to focus in their mind. Then any type of art meditation is going to help because it focuses the mind. The mind has a task, so it's task-orientated meditation basically. And so that stops the mind from being left on its own and panicking. So you focus it, but they're getting the benefit of meditation as well. So yeah, there are ways around it. Right? Okay, that's fascinating as well. And obviously, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'd love to hear more about your experiences in that type of yeah. Yeah, well, we've got a lesson on the material body layer coming up and material body anatomy and stuff. So it would be good to hear everyone's experiences regarding nutrition. The more we can all learn. Well, so really, you can broaden that out to the journey of life. Really, I mean, it depends where your cutoff point that you're talking about, because you could say that the whole journey of life, evolution of life, is a journey towards self-realization. So spiritual evolution is a journey towards self-realization. The human journey, the human spiritual journey, is a journey towards self-realization. So the growth of the Kundalini is a journey towards self-realization. So you could say, is life a fun journey? Well, as we know already, there's a mixture of both because of positive and negative karma, and having to balance that karma to get to the point of self-realization. But if you're asking about self-realization itself, well, self-realization is not really a line that you cross over. So it's more like opening a door to a next part of the journey. But and there can be some quite painful parts to the self-realization process, because the phases of self-realization themselves have a negative cycle, and they have a positive cycle, and then they have a unification cycle. What this is post Kundalini. So Kundalini phase itself can be quite a mixture of a process. You can get a lot of bliss in Kundalini phase, but you can also get a lot of pain because there's still blockages in the chakras, and the ego has to shatter and disappear. And so it can be a turbulent process. Some people know. Some people it's very gentle. It depends how much karma, negative karma, was left over when somebody starts their Kundalini awakening. Which is also, by the way, why people should never awaken their Kundalini too early, because there's too much karma and it causes all sorts of psychological problems and other problems. Go into that some other time maybe. But there's a lot of there can be it can be a gritty process to get to that point of end of Kundalini phase. That is a line, actually, because that's when two energies meet at the Bindu. We'll go through that when we go through the reincarnation lesson. But that point of the end of the Kundalini phase, then the phases of self-realization happen. And there's many phases within those cycles I just mentioned. There's the three cycles I just mentioned: positive cycle, negative cycle, positive cycle, unification cycle. Each of them are 7 years long. And each of them have phases within them. But once you're so what's happening in the negative cycle is that there's a concept called, well, let's say you're dragging through the effects of the karma that was left over. Let's just say you're dragging that through the process. Any karma that was left at the point of Kundalini awakening, positive and negative, it has an effect. It gets dragged through the process. And the negative cycle is the negative part, and the positive cycle is the positive part. But once that negative part is finished, then there's no more negative ever again for that particular soul, because it's left all negativity behind. Because suffering itself is only there to become awake, to awaken from our suffering. So it gets completely left behind, and then a new journey starts. And then that journey goes on and on and on and on. That soul will carry on for a long, 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 long period of time in that state. Carry on doing whatever its role is, whatever its purpose is. But eventually, and there'll be no more suffering in that soul ever again. Eventually, elaborating a bit on your question here, but eventually that soul will end its life cycle, because the soul itself is just a vehicle. That higher mind is just a vehicle for consciousness, the vehicle for the true self. So the true self will never end. So you will never end. You are infinite and eternal. But at some point, the energies that make up that soul will absorb back into the source. But at that point, that's a long, long, long way in the future, but at that point, there is no more individual awareness in that soul. It is universal awareness. So it becomes, through the journey of self-realization, it becomes universal awareness. And then eventually the energies of the soul will absorb back into the source. Everything moves in cycles, in the universe. So that's souls move in cycles, life moves in cycles. In fact, the whole universe moves in cycles. You have great universal cycles, and then it repeats again and again and again.